cool thing about that is that when we watch people, leaders, and groups almost dwell in the unknown, subsequently all sorts of good things happen.
Accepting reality is going to be a really interesting conversation. So to start, I just want to put forward a couple of the archetypes that I've seen play out in businesses, in society. Putting your head in the sand is, hey, I don't want to deal with this. It's stepping away and kind of turning away from what is actually going on. There's fake it till you make it, which is this approach. Interestingly, I actually researched that. I actually went in and kind of, where did this saying originate from? And interestingly, it came from a 1973 injunction from the Securities and Exchange Commission against a company, I wrote it down, which was called Dare to be Great Inc., which I found quite amusing. So there you go. Fake it till you make it. Dare to be great. Very good. Inc. And probably my favorite is from the modern philosopher George Costanza, who famously said, if it's not a lie, it's not a lie if you don't believe it. So when you look at these kind of, just random 3 examples that sprung to mind, if you don't believe it, then it must be true. If you put your head in the sand, then I'm creating a new reality because the reality I'm hiding from doesn't exist. And if I fake it till I make it, I'm putting myself in a reality that doesn't yet exist. What am I fundamentally doing? And this is where I want to throw it to Jutta, because this appears to be some form of mythical self-delusion that I've seen in leadership all over the world. But what's actually happening? What is driving people to actually embrace these lines of logic?
I find that so fascinating. I'm so glad you're actually saying that these 3 archetypes are actually delusions, because all 3 of them are a partial embracing of reality, aren't they? They're all selecting a sliver or a slice of reality and they're focusing on that. And that is completely different to how we conceptualize acceptance in psychology. So in psychology, acceptance is an increasingly cool term, actually, because it's come out of a whole tradition of behaviorism. And acceptance is the big theme of the 3rd wave and the 3rd dimension of behavior therapies. And so acceptance is really cool because in psychology, we're saying embrace what is here in its totality, not from a fatalistic kind of roll over and just let everybody walk all over you, but in an experiential way. And so by that, I mean, accept and embrace the good, the bad, and the ugly, especially the discomfort that comes with whatever reality is. And then if you're willing to actually do that, all sorts of new perspectives and insights open up. And so in behaviorism and in behavioral therapy, we are super interested in people moving to accept rather than avoid, which I think relates to the 3 archetypes that you've just been talking about, Adam.
Matt?
It's really interesting that so far we actually haven't really spoken too much actually about the process of acceptance.
Ooh.
or even the perception of what is real. And so for me, the first thing is actually making sure that you understand that what you're perceiving is as close to the truth as possible. Coming from a chemistry background, you do your A-levels and you get taught a certain model of the way that atoms interact with each other. And then you move to to university chemistry, and they basically tell you that everything you've learned before is wrong. They were just helpful models. And so you then move into another model of the way that atoms interact, and it's more complicated, and you start seeing all of these other bits and pieces around it. but it's still just a model, and you keep learning more and more advanced models that address, shall we say, almost say specific uses. None of them are necessarily correct or incorrect. In fact, all of them have a level of inaccuracy about them, because they're all just models of what the reality actually is, because we can never really know, because it's a quantum world, and there is always that level of uncertainty when you move into Heisenberg's realm. But there is that ability, the need to be able to find the appropriate model from which you can view the world around you. So if I just take today, we've had a lockdown, a change in lockdown stuff to do with the pandemic. There's a whole host of changes that are raging through the news media. Social media is awash with he said, she said, the whole US election. You would think that the world was in chaos. And yet I can look outside my window and I'm living in a peaceful street, and there's clouds in the sky, and okay, it's not particularly fantastic, but it's not raining. There is sun in the sky. I can see some blue. It's getting a bit cold, but the world isn't as bad as that perception that you'd have if you just focused on the TV. And I think, we get very het up in all of this incoming information. And so I think the first step of any acceptance is actually understanding what is the reality you need to accept.
And I love
and then from that, it's about learning, can you accept it, or are you avoiding it and deluding yourself about something else?
Matt, sorry for interrupting. I thought what you said was super critical and super important, because you said we get het up in, do we accept or do we not accept? So the opposite of acceptance is getting het up and fighting, and basically, like almost from a information processing perspective, fighting the reality that we're confronting or that we're facing. That is the opposite of accepting, rather than just allowing the conflict or the conflicting information to be there just for a moment. That, I think, is the distinction that we need to make in the first instance, to say when people are not accepting, they're effectively resisting. And by resisting, they're jumping the process that I think we're going to unpack to get to good decisions, good leadership, good strategy being implemented. And what we're saying, I think, and what I'm hoping that we're going to be talking about more, is what's the process of slowing down the way in which we encounter the conflicting, the difficult, the challenging complexity, that if we're allowing ourselves to see it.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you're saying there. And I think for me, one of the critical things that I'd love us to unpack today, that I think we live our life by specific models, right? We have specific stories that we tell ourselves, that these are the truths that help us make life a little bit less complicated. This is the way we do things. We get up in the morning, we go to work, we don't worry, we embrace the busyness of the tube in the morning. We embrace going into busy, crowded offices. And then all of a sudden, a massive change comes along. And I think that's, in my mind, where all of a sudden you get that fight, and you saw so much angst against a shift in what the reality is, because all of a sudden the models that people live by don't hold true anymore. And I think that's where you get that, a lot of people deluding themselves, wanting to believe that a conspiracy theory is perhaps more relevant than actually just the fact that there is a virus that somehow got into the world, and governments just don't know how to handle it properly because it's so new. And we don't really know what the appropriate level of response is, because obviously having, any death is too many, but then a certain number of deaths will happen anyway. So how do we get that balance right versus the economy and a whole set of things where our realities have changed dramatically this year? And yet, for a lot of us, we still get up in the morning, we have our breakfast or whatever, we do whatever we did in the morning, we follow our morning routines, we carry on working or not, but a lot hasn't changed, but we focus on the change rather than the things that stay stable.
Mm-hmm. I think what we're doing is we're laying out at the moment kind of the first fork in the road, which is our relationship with reality, and then our relationship with the reality that is internalized. Like one is external, one is internal. Like Matt, what you're talking about is very much conflict, change behavior, reconciling change of models. And it's, there is something happening in the world, and I, the individual who's receiving this information, need to reconcile that. However, if it challenges the way that I see the world, then that is another layer of complexity that I then need to reconcile. The other side of that is that ultimately truth is subjective. Like I think it's in Buddhism, there's 3 types of truths. There's conventional truth, provisional truth, and the ultimate truth. I looked at that and I'm just like, yeah. And like, what does that actually, like, are we talking different layers of abstraction, or are we trying to get to something that is more definitive that everyone can then agree on, except, okay, well, this is the truth that we're all going to rally around as a leadership team, as a society, as whatever, and then bond around that and then make relevant decisions. So it's kind of internal versus external, because within the internal side of things, I think, so I really want to unpack this, because I think from a leadership perspective, I have stood personally, and I know other people, and probably you good people have as well. You stand in front of people and you're like, what am I dealing with? Am I dealing with someone who doesn't have, or refuses to accept what's actually going on for whatever motivation, because they're just, they understand this is probably going to have an adverse impact on their reality or their circumstances, so they just don't want to deal with it for whatever it happens to be? Or how much of that thinking then starts to tiptoe into borderline personality disorder, to go, hey, I'm not going to touch this because of what I think and how I think what I think. And that's where I'm interested in, and we're definitely going to get to the models and the ways to kind of navigate through this. But I'm just interested in, from an internalization, like what makes people turn away from what is actually going on. I think it has to be fear at its core, because it's either fear, resistance, the fight that you speak about, Jutta, or something else that kind of triggers to go, I'm not buying into this, irrespective whether it's the truth or not.
It's so interesting. I'm not sure if it's just fear or other things that are related to this type of negative emotion, but it's definitely to do with our almost natural and instinctive recoiling from stuff that feels uncomfortable. It could be fear, it could be almost just, annoyance that something is not quite how we like it, almost we want it to be simple and it's not that simple. It's not necessarily fear, but it is just a discomfort, or it's not pleasant. And we, as humans, I at least, don't like to feel uncomfortable. I don't like to feel like not knowing. And the thing that I wanted to bring to this was this amazing term that relates to this the whole psychology of it. John Keats, a long time ago, talked about negative capability. And so he said negative capability is a man's ability to withstand running away mentally from something. It's a man's ability to tolerate ambiguity, to tolerate uncertainty, to tolerate mysteries. And I think that's really important. Without, reaching for, and I think he said, without this irritable reaching for ready-made solutions. And I think that's what it speaks to, Adam. It's this capability to be in the unknown. Because conversely, by saying this, I'm answering what you're talking about. I think it's our fear of the unknown that gets us to not accept what is.
Yeah. And I also think, adding on to that, there needs to be an acceptance that reality doesn't always have to make sense.
Right.
Which is the node that then feeds into ambiguity, uncertainty, complexity, risk, anxiety, all of these things that we're ultimately trying to find answers for, so then we can make sense of something and ultimately make a decision or behave accordingly. But the world isn't perfectly written fiction where everything makes perfect sense in the end. Reality doesn't always make sense. So I think acceptance of that would have to be one of the first kind of things to look at, because go on.
No, you go. You finish your thought.
Yeah, it's. I think there's this point around. I know I had a friend of mine ages ago. He was going through a hard time, and he just was, getting into drink and just not doing anything, just wanted to check out. And I remember he said, "I'll deal with reality when it starts to improve." And I'm like, okay. So he kind of put it back onto the inputs to be like, well, justify why I should get involved with this. I'm perfectly happy sitting this one out. And I thought, well, that's an interesting behavioral characteristic of dealing with it. It was consciously going, I choose to opt out of what I'm experiencing at the moment. So I don't know if that was someone tapping out due to capacity, threshold, tolerance, trauma. And I'm quite sure in the world of trauma, I imagine there's quite a lot of this where, the way that trauma victims, I remember I've watched some things, I've done a little bit of reading. The way that trauma victims will start to deal with these things is that they'll build fictional realities in their mind. Again, to George Costanza, it's not a lie if you believe it. So, and I've seen that at senior leaders in corporations and managers of teams. We see it in governments and politicians and this sort of thing. They just build this construct that then leads them into a position of confidence to act how they think they should act, irrespective of the circumstances, but usually in favor of a preconceived outcome that they've concocted or they're trying to achieve. And that's dangerous, because that's when you're making decisions based on a flawed set of assumptions and biases and facts. And history is littered with examples where that goes.
And the social science data is getting stronger and stronger, that it's the opposite of the quality or the characteristic of people, leaders, thought leaders in organizations and in any societies or groups that gets people to get the right things done. And so it's this closed-mindedness versus open-mindedness. And open-mindedness is one of the key characteristics of opening up doors, literally like opening up, accessing, tapping into intelligence, tapping into creativity. You guys have both heard of Bion, right? The psychoanalyst that is so good at talking about group processes. He said open-mindedness is the key skill to mastering life. And the thing that I want to add to this, it's not just about, accepting and being open that we need, but we need to literally stop ourselves from rushing to solutions. And I think that's the other difficult bit about acceptance that is so unintuitive to us, right? So it's unintuitive to experience stuff that's unpleasant, but it's also unintuitive not to jump to do. And I think that's what I'm coming back to John Keats, this negative capability. So how do we cultivate this capability of not rushing to do, to just sit in the not doing? And the cool thing about that is that when we watch people, leaders, and groups almost dwell in the unknown, subsequently all sorts of good things happen, all sorts of functional things happen. But when they have this impulse driven, there's an itch and they scratch, more often than not, short term, less intelligent solutions get created.
So it's interesting. The way that I've understood what you've just described is almost very similar in relation to finding the space to tap into creativity. Because if I can find a space where I'm looking for answers, I'm pushing myself to look for answers, I'm not finding them, the world is not certain, I don't like the reality and the circumstances I'm being placed with. If I can find that mental space to actually kind of check out, quote unquote, for a couple of minutes or however long, and just find that stillness, not only will I start to compute what is actually going on, because I'm not hunting for an immediate answer or a quick fix, I'll probably come up with better thinking in relation to a set of possible solutions.
Yeah. And I think just to add to that, I think if you're looking at creativity from the, from a comedic perspective, at least, then you have to be able to see reality for what it is. You have to be able to see through or cut through a lot of the noise to reach those core truths, whatever layer of truth it is, that you can then use to make something funny and resonate with people. So I think you are right, and I would say comedy is probably one of the ultimate expressions of creativity. There are other ways to be creative in that area, but it's always, when you're working in the marketing world, whether it's branding or positioning or anything of that, you're looking for those core truths, those one very simple messages that really, really just cut right to the chase of what you're looking to do, to achieve the core story that you want somebody to think about you as an organization, as a person. And that really does come to that sense of being able to distill out what is the truth.
So am I correct in understanding what you're hypothesizing or asserting is that in times of ambiguity, or where you don't have complete information and you're not really liking where things are going, one of the things you can do is really find that stillness and go back to first principles in relation to who am I, what do I want, or what is good for me, where am I taking this, and then kind of become a little bit more dependent on that.
Yeah, and I would almost argue that it's going beyond who am I, because that's incredibly subjective, to more can I feel the breath coming in and out of my lungs, can I, what am I experiencing, and actually being very much more in touch with the senses that you're getting, and then being able to track those back. There was a mindfulness exercise I learned where you would sort of try and lie down in a dark room, and it sort of comes down to meditation, where it's probably very basic mindfulness, and Jutta, I'm sure you'll be able to tell us way more about this, but essentially the thoughts will come in, and rather than engaging with the thoughts, it's about recognizing and allowing them to slip past. And so it's almost about recognizing the sensation, seeing the sensation for what it is, but not engaging with it. So if you feel cold, you're not running to get a jumper and breaking that meditation. I feel cold. That's interesting. And then how is that impact, and then sort of probe, how does that feel on the, on the arms of, on the skin on your arms, or the hairs, or those sorts of things. And I think that's really where you're able to pull back to a very fundamental level as to self, if you will, without the construct of who we are, to then be able to build up a better perspective of the outside stimuli that we then need to respond to.
Yeah, and I think we're almost through all these, new next gen technologies, we are re-educating ourselves in a world that's almost created delusions, and that has almost created too much top-heavy stuff that prevents us from seeing reality for what it is. Because either putting my head in the sand or overreacting is effectively a coping mechanism that is the opposite of just sitting with reality. And I think at the core of what we're discussing, guys, actually, I only realize that now, is creativity. It's actually allowing for creativity to happen in all sorts of directions. And creativity has to be allowed. And so this word acceptance is very similar to allowing. And the evolution of our knowledge of this, like, again, I'm coming back to behaviorism. When we started to understand behavior in humans, like in the 50s and 60s, Skinner, we were doing animal behavior models, and we were saying people can be conditioned, right? If you do operant conditioning on somebody, you can predict their behavior. And Skinner said, the rat is always right. So if the rat does something that you don't expect, you've set the conditions up incorrectly. That's the first wave of our understanding of why people do the things that they do. And then we started to realize that actually people do all sorts of irrational things. And that's when we're realizing that people are actually not staying close to reality, the sensory reality that you're speaking of, Matt, right? Almost relearning that I sense something, I feel something. And so the second wave of behavioral therapies was talking about, Albert Ellis, cognitive behavioral therapy. I have an irrational thought. It's irrational for me to disagree with you if you're my authority figure, but I do it anyway. I sabotage myself and you because you've hurt my feelings. And that's irrational. So it's adding another dimension onto behavior. That makes sense. But the base behaviorism still stays. And so we understood a bit more. So we're starting to talk about why people are irrational and how we could get people to be more rational again. And the third wave of behavioral therapies is adding another insight, another perspective has opened up. And it says, actually, we're not that interested in what's true or what's right. We're actually more interested in paying attention to what is here and re-educating ourselves to be with feeling warm, feeling cold, feeling pleasant, feeling unpleasant before we start solving the problem. And that, as it turns out, tends to be really helpful for people to make good decisions and to be creative. And that's why all these mindfulness exercises are coming in, because people are so quick and are so fast to come up with a coping mechanism without even knowing whether it's the right coping mechanism for the situation that we're finding ourselves in.
Let me throw a spanner in the works.
Come on.
In the current times, last time I was in Tokyo, I managed, a good friend of mine put me in front of, at the time, a state-of-the-art virtual reality piece of kit, and strapped me and took me for the ride of my life. And as you have VR and AR start to work their way beyond gaming, but into actual functional elements of society, of healthcare, of workplace, how to have meetings, and all these different things are now coming in. The game of what is reality is now about to become multivariant, and that brings with it a whole new set of challenges, because the stuff that I've been exposed to recently from a tech perspective has blown my socks off. It's now at the point where I'm like, yeah, this is good to go. Whereas 5 years ago it was still it's a bit clunky, and you can still see the edges. Now you can completely immerse yourself in a different reality. And it only takes about 2 to 3 minutes before you're there. You can see it, you can feel it, you can touch it, and you've completely abandoned where you physically are, and your brain has now jumped into this world driven by technology. And it's fantastic. It's incredibly addictive. With the click of a button, you can go here or there, or you can ride a blood molecule up through the leg and into the heart and back out into the brain. You can jump on the surface of Mars and walk around and pick up rocks and just all sorts of crazy stuff that, from a reality perspective, it's happening. So I'm interested, Jutta, from your take, what's actually happening in the meat between my ears? Is this something that the stimulus is therefore convincing my brain that this is my reality? Therefore, this is the next step in relation to, kind of stepping away from the actual reality? Like, am I just, is it just a technological representation of what it would be 20 years ago if I just sat there and imagined these things and I believed it to them to be true? Like, what's actually going on neurologically here, do you think?
I'm answering this in absolute, in the way that we're now in the third wave of behavioral therapies believe is useful. Let's wait for the fourth wave. But the third wave of answering a question like that is, it doesn't matter all that much what is truth. It matters much more to discuss and to go and talk about what's the function of me immersing myself in that reality, and what does it do to me? Do you see how I'm sidestepping your question? And I don't mean to sidestep your question in a nasty way, because, first of all, I'm also not a neuroscientist anyway, right? And I'm saying that if we are radically, like, this is radical behaviorism. So in radical behaviorism, which we're finding is much more liberating, because guys, we're talking about freedom here as well. We're talking about acceptance, and acceptance in order to be free, to actually choose something that is right for us, that we've thought about, as opposed to denying or compulsively coping with something that we don't like. So in radical behaviorism of the third kind, where we're saying we're not just machines that are manipulated, we can't just invalidate each other's irrationality, because it just doesn't work for all these complex problems, right? So just doing cognitive behavioral therapy is just not good enough. If I say to you, you're irrational for getting worked up right now, boys, by me speaking too much and you wanting to speak, right? It doesn't help. The thing that helps is to say, what does that VR experience do to us? And in the situation that we're finding ourselves, is this something related to things that we value and that are important to us? Or is this something that might be actually moving us away from what's important or what's valuable? So I can't deny that these VR experiences are becoming more real, and that they almost are messing with our experience of reality. And the thing that I think is interesting is, what's the function? What is helpful and what is less helpful about me going into that reality rather than staying in my own?
And just to layer on top of what you've both said before we unpack it, there's a really interesting sort of few developments from the tech world that I think is really going to mess with our ability to discern reality from, or truth from lie, if you will. Obviously we've seen the amazing deep fakes that people are creating, but there's
the amazing what?
Deep fakes, where you can basically show somebody. I think the traditional one was Barack Obama saying something that he never said before. Basically, you take the video and you manipulate it in a very clever way. And of course, when they first started creating these were very, they were challenging to do, but they're incredibly convincing. NVIDIA, with its latest graphics card, has just brought out some technology that will essentially allow us to send much smaller pieces of information down phone lines when we're having these videos. So essentially, we'll take the photograph of the room we're in, and then it will iterate on what our faces are doing. So rather than us actually having a live stream of a video and feeling that there is some real connection down a line on through the screen, which, while a poor substitute for being in person, is at least a substitute. All of a sudden, what they'll be doing, there'll be a photograph of me sitting in my chair, and the movements that I make will just be plotted against a subset of points in time, on my, in space, and then it will be reanimating my photograph. And so you can then take that to a logical extension where that reanimation may not be me. That reanimation could be an avatar or a photo of somebody else. And I think you start moving into a world where the differences between the reality of who we are, what we look like, become very different from actually how do we make each other feel. So we can start to appear, it's a bit like that going into Second Life. All of a sudden you're going into another, you're turning video calls into a Second Life experience where actually we become somebody, we can be whoever we want to be.
Yeah, so this conversation is going in a very interesting direction. So let's just look to the future for a moment, because you're absolutely right. Between VR and AR and deep fakes and AI and all this stuff that's really gearing up, and some of it is incredibly challenging. I was reading a paper maybe 6 months ago from an American kind of political journal, and they were saying that they expect within 3 years' time, video footage of politicians is, generally speaking, not to be trusted, because the technology is here where I can make anyone do anything. I know AOC was in, I think, a Senate hearing or something, and she was talking about some deep fakes that were going around about her in relation to, you know, pornography, and how they'd been kind of handed around the political set. And she was like, hey, have you seen this? Have you actually seen me do this on video? Because obviously it's not me, but you can't differentiate that it's not her. And as soon as you start kind of messing with this, you are creating other realities. So let's just kind of, you know, this conversation is about accepting reality, but just for a moment, let's step forward. Because what is reality based on the media and the things that we consume as individuals and as professionals and as leaders is about to become a whole lot more challenging. So the difficulty around reconciling what is reality is going to have the rules are changing. Okay. Whereas, you know, if I gave you a video of me drinking this glass of water, you go, Adam's drinking a glass of water. But if it's done with, you know, some particular technologies, then it mightn't be me, it mightn't be water, and it may not have ever happened, but you've got visual representation of this that you are now accepting as truth. So I can see already this level of skepticism in particular corners of the internet is starting to get traction here, where they're like, you know what, I don't trust anything I see. And this is potentially one of the drivers that people are doubling down, particularly on conspiracies, or they're making up their own minds or coming up with their own version of reality, that you can't tell people right or wrong because they believe what they believe, because the way that particularly technology is taking the truth, quote unquote, is becoming less and less credible. So accepting reality, Matt, to some of your points in relation to, okay, well, who am I fundamentally in this set of circumstances, and kind of reconciling your reality based on not what you see or your environment, but who you are in it, might be the right way forward. Because I think this topic is going to get a whole lot more complex over the coming couple of years.
I hear you. And I think that's really important to talk about. And what I would like to bring on the table then, piggybacking on what you're doing, Matt, the question of who am I and what is right for me or what's important for me becomes even more important. And I think we almost want to steer that conversation towards a, you know, what's good for me, or what is also good for me and for the bigger, you know, society, what transcends just what's good for me personally, raiding the planet, you know, using all the natural resources at the expense of other people, what's good for us. And I think that goes to this values-based living that I would like to dial up in the discussion. Because I have to necessarily, based on what you guys have said, dial down the discussion around what's real and what's reality, because we will not know that much anymore, and it's going to become more and more confusing. And so in the game that we're playing here, the question that we could ask is this real? And that's a question about content. And we might not be able to answer it, but we could also ask, is this helpful? And that's a question about function. So what is helpful in where we are and where we're moving towards? What are the identities, right, Matt? What are the who's of who we are that we can dial up, or the conversations about that, so that we don't wreck this whole planet, and so we can actually continue to live together in a more consensus-driven way than what we're seeing in the last few weeks before the US election right now, the polarization being almost complete.
Yeah, I like where this is going, because what you're putting forward, Jutta, is a morals and principles-based evaluation model, which I really like, because, you know, I'm moderately well-traveled. I think I've done 80 plus countries for work and travel and things.
Moderately, darling.
Well, there's 216 or something. I've got a few to go. The problem with more travel is you realize how much you haven't seen. The trick that I think, or the thing I'm trying to grasp after, is really one of where, let me think this through. how do we as individuals start to reconcile reality based on a moral compass or on a moral set of values when there are very different moral values in different parts of society? The one thing about travel is that I've realized is that the overwhelming majority of people on Earth are good people. And the overwhelming majority of people on Earth all want the same thing: food, opportunities and education for their children, roof over their head, peace, like just fundamental things. Everyone wants the same thing, from the back blocks of Addis Ababa or Chittagong to central London. Everyone wants the same thing. We are significantly more similar than we are different. Mm-hmm. However, when you look at kind of the way that the environment is framed up, divide and conquer, countries, borders, immigration, all of these sort of things, political faith, sexual persuasion, gender, like there's a lot of lines that have been set. But I want to pull this thread a little bit, Jutta, this approach of using a principle or moral based construct to ensure that even if we don't necessarily understand what's happening in reality at the moment, mm-hmm. we can all move in the same direction, create a mutual reality based on what we all value, as opposed to looking at deepfakes or VR or the news, or I don't want to watch what's happening because I'm not ready to deal with it, or whatever happens to be driving it internally or externally. Because I think linking all this back to leadership, this sort of thinking, or this sort of line of thinking, feels like there could be an awful lot of value in it if you can get everyone on the same bus.
Can I?
Yep.
Am I okay to go?
Yeah,
because I'm watching Matt as well, because there's some thinking going on there as well. Are you okay? I'm jumping in right now. Yeah. Because I actually think we need to even walk quite slowly, because if we were to get to a discussion about morals and ethics, we almost need to do a step beforehand that is about exploring possibility. And I really want to bring into this discussion now this really cool premise of mindfulness-based, acceptance-based therapies. That is, let's hold the truth a little bit more lightly than we normally do. And all sorts of good things happen when we help people learn to explore potential, learn to have conversations about what if this were true? What if you didn't have to, for example, take the need away to improve the bottom line? What if you could accept that you are in a declining industry? Do you see where I'm going? By asking these questions, I'm inviting you to almost become a bit more playful. And I completely accept that if somebody's watching or listening and they're saying, easy said, hard to do if you've got people hanging off you and depend on you, and I'm asking you to hold the truth lightly. It's almost it's a mindset thing, right? It's about almost becoming a little bit less rigid in the difficulty that we're facing by saying, what if, or how could we, or what does it feel to see the world in a different way, so that we create a bit more potential, so we become a little bit more flexible, so that we almost allow the conversation tone, this is about tone of conversation, to shift from certainty to, did we already say that this, this capability to be in uncertainty, this liminality, guys, the things that we all experience, but we don't really focus on when we change state from child to adult, it's like this, the word liminality is all about, transitioning, but could we focus a bit more on, transition states, potential, possibility, and in that way shift the conversation away from needing to solve the puzzle. Matt, what did you want to say?
So kind of backing up a little bit,
Yeah.
because there was a lot of the conversation got me thinking about the potential for kind of the approach that a lot of my, bringing out the sci-fi geek in me here, but a lot of the, the great sci-fi authors will have sort of changed one thing. They'll go into the future, but they'll change something significant. So what happens if you could store your consciousness and implant it in another organic being in the future, sort of altered carbon? Or, for example, Total Recall. What happens if I can implant memories? I no longer need to travel. I can go off and have an experience. I don't need to go to Mars to go to Mars. I've already been there because I've just been in, and someone's programmed that into my brain. And then my reality is that I did those things. So my reality could be that at some point I went to Japan and learned Japanese, and then all of a sudden I'd still know Japanese, even though I never went to Japan and learned Japanese. It just the concept of what our reality is based on what we remember and where we've been. And if we can start messing with that, which we're already doing through so many different mediums, and we're going to start doing it increasingly over the next years and decades, through VR, AI, and a whole host of other things, at some point, you have to come to that values-based approach to self of decision making, because nothing else is real. Because you can't trust anything. You can't trust anything you remember, because maybe somebody's just, injected you and put you in a machine somewhere, and all of a sudden your memories are rewritten. And if you're going into virtual reality, for example, versus the real world, and it's so real, how do you tell which one you're in? And you would have to behave consistently in both. Otherwise, you create a huge disconnect between those two, and you'll end up having behaviors that you could get away because it's just a computer game, and therefore you can go around killing all sorts of people because it's just pixels on a screen, through to being virtual reality, where actually that could bleed back into the real world if you can't distinguish between the two.
Well, this is a lot of the psychology work that's been done in relation to the training of warfare and the impact of games and remote warfare through drones and these sort of things, and training simulations, and what it actually means, for people to now, conduct military exercises in very real world scenarios, but do it from the comfort of a beanbag in their lounge room.
Absolutely. I remember going to Anne Frank's house twice. So I went first time as a 13, 14-year-old, and at the end of walking around the Anne Frank house, the first time I went, there were lots of black and white still photographs. Now, I know that you can still fake a photograph. There's been some great examples of that in history, where people have done things with fairies in photographs and all sorts. But there was a reality. I'll look it up. They're fantastic. They wouldn't pass muster today, but still they're great. But because they were real on a piece of photographic paper, who would question it at the time? They were some of the first fake photographs. But if you look at those pictures, they had so much impact. Now, I'm not sure if you look at me being older, and having seen, been through the story before, but when I then went back, they changed the way they'd done it. They'd archived the physical photographs, and they were showing the photographs on TV screens. And all of a sudden, even though the imagery was the same, there was I felt there was more of a disconnect because of the medium through which you were seeing it. So I think we've already learned to distance ourselves from the reality of what we see on the screen to an extent. Because of movies, because of all sorts of stuff. So we numb ourselves to the moving picture a little bit. But I think if we then put those memories in, we're going to really struggle to make that difference.
Okay, so you've touched on something really interesting, which is reality authenticity. So if I see something in the newspaper, am I more likely to believe it than what I would be watching it on the 6 o'clock news? Potentially. because, you know, the news that's fit to print, it's in ink, it's hard, there's less perceived manipulation in relation to this thing that I'm
That's
holding.
generational. I think my kids wouldn't agree that, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like Matt said, you know, you're getting older, so now it's this change in skepticism. But then there is also, I think, what this opens up for the opportunity for reality to be manipulated. Like, even if you look at the last 5 years, and, you know, foreign powers meddling in elections and Brexit and all, you know, there's all these kind of perceptions that may or may not be able to be proven. You know, we're not going to get into that. But it's a circumstance that the question of the authenticity of what we are being fed, given, consuming, I think even makes a stronger case for a moral-based framework for how to interact and accept a reality. Because I believe, based on where things are going, the authenticity of what is coming in front of us is going to be more and more questionable, because there are more and more, you know, driving interests in relation to pulling things different way, economic, political, whatever it happens to be. And I think that at some point, irrespective of age or experience, an individual will get to a point where they go, okay, look, I think I know what's going on based on this set of inputs. However, I can only authenticate what I can authenticate, and the things that I can't authenticate, do I take them and take that as a reality and then move on? Or alternatively, do I go back to something inside of me in relation to, well, how will I react based on what I know? And again, my brain keeps coming back to, there's really something within this moral principle-based structure of reality acceptance that I don't think has been, like, I haven't encountered anything from a literature or conversational perspective in my professional career that's kind of, you know, looking at this beyond kind of the basic stuff, which, you know, mission, vision statements and, you know, guiding principles and North Stars and all this stuff. But it's all seen as very fluffy and very abstract, that kind of guides a company or a leader or a team to go and do something based on what they're trying to achieve. But that's the point. It's outcome driven, as opposed to something which is more purposeful, a way to live, as opposed to I do X to achieve Y.
Maybe the outcome is living a good life.
Yeah.
So we need to focus on and whatever our definition of a good life being a good person is.
I actually think, before we can even talk about purpose and morality, we need to make it safe to share reality and to be real with each other. Because as I'm listening to you guys, I hear so much about, you know, the potential of technology and manipulation to mess up our certainty of knowing what's real, what is actually, what is actually real in the moment. So the trust of me, even trusting myself, is getting eroded. And if that is so, which I believe it is so, then to me, it makes sense that there's an increasing demand for acceptance and mindfulness-based frameworks to help re-educate people to almost sense what's real in the midst of being manipulated, in the midst of being having memories implanted, having opportunities to have more and more layers of reality being put on top of each other. And I just keep wanting to come back to this idea of sharing and sharing authentically. So Adam, before we're talking about purpose and morality, it's about opening up a little bit, like, you know, like lifting from the veneer, lifting up this question of, I wonder what it's like to be in your skin. I wonder if you could tell me what it feels like to be Adam today. And in that way, I'm creating, you know, a bit of a possibility of two truths being real, but I'm also creating this kind of this openness to different realities, both being right and true. And I'd like to add another word to this: vulnerability.
Yeah.
I think we're not going to get to morality and purpose-driven and wholesome action unless we're talking about ourselves and the leaders that are listening to this, maybe considering that vulnerability is the superpower here. Vulnerability and sharing what is real for me in this, and really genuinely wanting to hear what it's like to be you in this reality. So we can almost reground ourselves in, we all want the same thing. Adam, I loved so much that you reminded us that most of us want the same thing. But we forget. So we need to ground ourselves through our 5 senses in this is what it feels like to be Matt today. This is what it feels like to be Adam today. Adam.
Yeah. Vulnerability is a superpower. I've heard that a couple of times over the last couple of months, particularly during, at the moment, we're heading towards the end of 2020. So we're still in the midst of global pandemic. And it is a superpower. It's absolutely a superpower. It creates a very credible line of empathy with those who you are prepared to be vulnerable in front of. And what you're doing is this might be a bit too abstract even from my mind. What am I kind of doing if I'm being vulnerable and I'm sharing and you are empathizing with my vulnerability? Are we not creating a new reality based in a particular set of very human moral conditions or principles on which that then we can start to make decisions and move in particular directions from, as opposed to listening to news inputs and papers and videos and things? Why don't we create a deeper understanding through the reciprocity of being empathetic, like truly empathetic, and really understanding each other on if it's a team or a company or even citizens of a country, to know, okay, well, this is who we are, this is what we want, and this is the direction that we're going. And I like that on paper. My immediate kind of knee jerk is, well, how much of this is just a reincarnation of fake it till you make it, just a little bit twisted? Because what we're trying to do is we're bringing in an aspirational objective, and then we are going to actualize ourselves into that reality. Like, isn't it kind of somewhat similar? I don't know.
I thought you were going, isn't this somewhat risky to go there, but you're going in a different direction. I'm just thinking that disclosure, vulnerability is effectively the same as disclosure. Vulnerability, like to disclose, right? To share, to explore, to ask, and then to listen for the answer. That's what we're talking about. And you could share stuff that's really personal about you, about your history, about who you are. And so you remake who you are. Like, so I think I'm a fake, I'm going to make it. And this route that we're discussing right now is for me to share my insecurities. But there's another type of disclosure that I think is more relevant for this. And that is less going into the fake it to make it realm, Adam. And that's disclosing what's real for me in the moment right now. What's real for me in the meeting right now. Exploring what is real for you, Matt, in the meeting. Trying to understand why, Adam, you are now silent, for example. And inviting you to share with me what your reality of the moment is. I don't need you to share your history or your ambition even of what you want to become. And basically going back to the base discussion that we were starting from with, what is acceptance? Acceptance means being open to sitting with good, bad, and ugly in the moment. And it's that openness of mind that we're trying to train, right? That we're trying to get people to practice by holding truth a bit more lightly, because my truth is only one of 3 right now. And by inviting 2 different truths in. That's the disclosure, and that's the sharing that I'm talking about.
Yeah. So, and that acceptance of that, if you're doing it by yourself, accepting that alternative perspective is incredibly difficult. For example, I think I'm stupid. So now I need to tell myself repeatedly that I made an error, but because I made an error, I am not stupid. Like it's disconnecting, cause and effect, or cause and perceived reality. That's an interesting one.
That's what I think.
Go
ahead.
Yeah. Matt, what are your
That's
thoughts?
what I think, because we're talking about awareness here, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about self-awareness. And that's what I say, if you want to improve performance in your organizations, practicing mindfulness, self-awareness training by yourself is so much less effective than awareness training with each other. You guys are so much more mindful of me right now, and based on our history, that if I want to increase my awareness of myself, we need to help each other become more self-aware, right? So doing this by yourself is really hard. But in a leadership team, practicing openness, practicing perspective taking, that's the gold dust that gets us to be in that, that starting point position for saying, okay, right, so what options do we actually have? What's the most creative solution? Because that's why we're talking about acceptance, aren't we? We're talking about acceptance because we want to make smarter, more strategic decisions in the place of an increasingly multi-reality environment. That freaks me out.
It does, but I think if we go back several thousand years, Marcus Aurelius said, everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth. And I think if we realize that actually, I'm of that increasing belief that because the world appears to be so much more complex than it ever was, and we have made it more complex, but at the same time, it's still just as simple. You wake up or you don't in the morning. You need food you need to eat to fuel your body. It's more comfortable if you have shelter and a warm bed. The realities of our existence haven't really changed, and yet we've made them so much more complicated for ourselves. And I think we get hung up on trying to really understand the truth of what is going on in the world, whereas actually just accepting that the sun's out or it's not, it's raining or it's not, those small things that we can accept become much easier. I think it becomes harder when you're then trying to navigate a path for an organization, because what you're trying to do there is not just go, right, everybody, we need to make sure everybody has food on their plate and yada, 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 or we've got an organization that we need to keep, that it would be preferable for it to survive, I think is probably the word to use there. And you will feel responsibility for navigating a path through, through uncharted waters. But I think a lot of the time then is just making sure that you've got a way of sitting with the relevant inputs and trying to actually say, well, which of these do we really need to listen to? And who around the room feels that this one is more important than that one? And can you explain, and sitting with everybody's truths and perceptions, so that you can try and come up with a more multi-sided perspective on the reality that each of us are perceiving.
Yeah, that's the catchphrase: sitting with everyone's truths and coming up with a more multi-level, multi-dimensional version of reality. Is that how you just said it, Matt?
Yeah, pretty much. I think you said it a little bit nicer.
Adam, I thought that's a key phrase that we want to remember from today.
It's absolutely definitely a key phrase. But then to loop back to something you said, Jutta, in relation to looking at the what if, because if I'm in an executive leadership team and we are looking at a reality from very different perspectives, and there are different truths, and we have acceptance of that. So we have more data in which we can then kind of evaluate and make better decisions. But then it's also, okay, well, let's spend a bit of time on the principles of scenario planning. What if this happens? What if, Matt's view on the world is more accurate than mine or Jutta's or whatever? And, and start to really explore the dimensions of different realities. By default, we are going to have a stronger understanding of the environment, real or otherwise, perceived or otherwise, factual or otherwise, on which we can then make better decisions. And then as you look out the window or gather your data or wherever you are pulling your reality from based on the conversation you're having or the decision you're trying to make, you're then going to know those what ifs, and you'll see the what ifs if they start to pop up earlier, and then you can get ahead of it. So then you can actually be closer to the reality that you're living, as opposed to just the way that you see it. That would be one way that I would kind of roll that into something that's practical and actionable.
Yeah. And for me, watching and observing and commenting on it, I would say that's absolutely in line with where the data on effective teamwork is, because the data bizarrely says the process of teamwork matters much more than the content of what people discuss. If the process as an experience, experientially, is a process of acceptance, is a process of exploring possibility, just quantitatively, the options and the choices and the opportunities for choosing the right choices is bigger. So what you've talked about is effectively a focus on a process that promotes psychological flexibility and that promotes open-mindedness and that promotes perspective taking.
And I think there's also...
Yeah, go ahead. That's good.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going to say, I think there's also, the acceptance of the validity of different perspectives. Back to the point you're making. For example, if I'm going to cook dinner tonight and I look at a recipe, I look at the recipe and it's asking me to do all these things. Like, you're going to make this particular dessert. You need to go out. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, it's got strawberries in it, and strawberries are out of season, and they want me to go and do all this work and make this thing, and it's too hard and it's too much. Versus Matt might be making dessert tonight, and he can pull the strawberries and out of the freezer. He has whipped cream in a can, so that's no problem, and he can bang the dessert together in a couple of minutes. Both of these perspectives are true, but they're coming from different experiences and perceptions, and valuing those, because some ways under particular circumstances, my reality of the way forward will be right. We're better off not to make that dessert. And in some ways, Matt's reality will be right because it'll be so easy. It'll be an easy win. And even just through that as an example, we can start to come up with different variants of a solution set to ultimately reach the objective that we're trying to get to. So I think it's the acceptance and true understanding and empathizing with the perspective and what that actually means. Because I think not only will you understand the other person, I think it'll also broaden your own perspective of how you see the circumstances, ultimately becoming a better leader, I think, because you're then going to understand the world in which you're operating in with much more depth and technicolor, for want of a better phrase.
You've just said the how-to to promoting acceptance in yourself and in a team. I've written it down. It is the action and the proactive, consciously deliberate action of valuing different realities, guys. I'm going to take that one away. Lovely.
I
like it. Matt, what are you taking away, sir?
Oh, so I've learned so much today. To summarize it in just one kind of thing, it would be remiss. But I think what I really liked is kind of the multi-levels of truth, the different layers and just the different perspectives, and trying to, again, just trying to be mindful of accepting that what we see is just a very narrow view of reality, and that by maybe if you shift your perspective 90 degrees, you're seeing a different object even though you're looking at the same thing. And I think for me that just is so powerful when we see everything that's going on in the world at the moment, where actually not just looking at it from a self perspective, but from a group perspective, and from a, what does this mean from my values perspective, is really important. You know, if you go and put yourself in another environment, you want to be able to represent yourself with those same consistent values, whether it's real or artificial. And I think that's going to be one of the key things that as a human race we're going to have to contend with, is how do we deal with multiple versions of reality, life inside the matrix, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. Hours of fun there. But yeah, I think you're absolutely bang on. Again, it's, yeah, and when you look at those those different versions of reality and empathize and connect with other people's perspectives and adopt them and, truly understand them, I think it comes down to an element of then how you communicate. Again, like, this comes out of my mouth so often. It's not what you say, it's how you're heard. So if you're trying to connect with people who see things differently or have different realities, show that you understand, and even show when you don't understand. What is it, Jutta? Be fascinated, be curious without judgment. It's this like, oh, what's going on there? I don't really understand, but I want to. And it's in a non-threatening, non-judgmental way. So I think that then leads into kind of one of the two, my main takeaways from this. The first in relation to the power or the value that can come from a moral or principle set model of how to conduct one's person when there is ambiguity or uncertainty or not complete information in relation to reality or what's actually going on. And doubling down on that feels relatively safe, because what's the next best alternative? Doing nothing, putting your head in the sand, faking it till you're making it, believing the lie. Like, the BATNA is relatively rubbish. The other takeaway that I like is one that's much more from how all three of us reacted to the topic of where technology is driving this conversation. It's like, it is the spanner in the works in relation to what is real. Like, this game is changing, and how it will be used for good and for bad remains to be seen. But, kick around in a few corners of the internet and you'll see what I mean. Like, you can see some things which absolutely are not true and 100% believable. And we as people, as leaders, as citizens, we need to reconcile this and understand our relationship with these inputs. And that therefore makes a stronger case to really understand, what are the principles that we're going to stand on when we start making decisions moving forward in a more technological based world.
How fascinating. I say, let's keep talking.
Yeah, curious without judgment. I like it. Excellent. The strategy behind accepting reality. Like and subscribe. And should you enjoy more of this banter, we have other topics and yet more to come. Don't we?
Watch this space.
Yeah.
Fabulous.